And for the next half hour, I'll be reading from the Investigative Post on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. No consequences for landlord in a fatal fire. A University of Buffalo student died last year after a fire broke out in his unpermitted attic apartment. So far, the property owner, Joseph Parlato, has faced no repercussions. It's been a year since a fire destroyed a University Heights house and claimed the life of 25-year-old University of Buffalo student Rameshwar Brahmat after flames and smoke consumed his attic rental, later deemed unfit for human occupancy and not legal habitable space by city inspectors. Nevertheless, the city's housing court last week gave landlord Joseph Parlato yet another month to fix 11 outstanding code violations at 16 Merrimack Street, a block from UB's South Campus. No one mentioned Rameshwar's death at last week's court date. After a brief summary of the violations by City Housing Inspector Brian Higgins, Parlato's attorney assured the housing court judge, Philip Dabney, that they would be remedied soon. In total, the hearing lasted 3 minutes. Housing court is a standing joke. Fred Brace, the former housing court liaison from 2009 to 2021, told Investigative Post, "I'm not surprised. I'm just angry. Nobody cared that somebody actually died in that apartment," said Kubi Bramblat, Rameshwar's sister. "I have faced the biggest loss of my life. It's just another day over there." University Heights resident Adam Neese said Rameshwar's death is the second in an unlicensed rooming house in his neighborhood this year. The first happened a few streets away at 54 Minnesota Avenue, a property with a long history of code violations owned by landlord Andre Foster. "If properties were being inspected annually, this would have been caught," said Neese. "Inspectors have so much teeth, but they're treating people with kid gloves." According to records, city inspectors neglected to inspect 16 Merrimack for a decade, from 2012 until 2022. On March 21st of last year, about a month prior to the fire, inspectors gave the property a passing grade. Lou Petrucci, commissioner of city's Permits and Inspections Department, has declined to comment on the case, noting that it happened before his tenure as commissioner. Investigative Post previously reported on Parlato's failure to pay $248,283 in property taxes and garbage fees on his portfolio of rentals, to the point that 3 properties were sent foreclosure notices last month. One of his properties, behind on taxes but not to the point of a foreclosure notice, has been listed for sale. Investigative Post also found that fire marshals failed to note that Rameshwar had died in their investigation and left most of their investigation report blank. Parlato currently has active violations with the city for renting out 2 other attic rooms in the University Heights, one right next door to 16 Merrimack, without the proper permit, though neither are being adjudicated in housing court. An Investigative Post reporter confirmed that students were living in one of the properties as recently as last month. To date, Parlato has not been issued any fines in housing court for 16 Merrimack. Sibu Nair is the Deputy Director of Asian American Affairs for Governor Hochul. The role often calls for Nair to advocate for UB's international students and work with those recently arrived from India. Many find themselves in a housing pinch, Nair said. Under financial pressure and fearful of speaking out, they end up trapped in subpar housing, even if there are problems like mold and lack of heat. It's all about money. The landlords can exploit the students, Nair told Investigative Post. Students don't know their legal rights. They don't understand the building code. They're very scared of coming forward and expressing their concerns. The landlords are definitely taking advantage of that. On June 8th, City Inspector Stephen Rucker went to 16 Merrimack and found that the landlord had addressed 3 code violations, including boarding up its windows and conducting a post-fire asbestos survey. But 11 other code violations had not been corrected. Parlato's attorney, Stephen Townsend, said that most of the violations will be addressed once the city accepts the architectural drawings submitted for review. Petrucci told Investigative Post that his department has not received any drawings yet. Jim and Delora, Parlato's property manager, refused to answer questions after the court hearing, and Delora had been cited by inspectors for failing to obtain a required property manager's license. According to city records, housing inspectors have visited 16 Merrimack at least 51 times since 2004. The property failed 18 of those inspections. Records indicate that inspectors did not inspect 16 Merrimack for over 10 years, from 2012 until 2022. When they did return, they cited the property for 2 violations, which were subsequently corrected. Investigative Post has requested the city's inspection report conducted in March 2025. Inspectors gave the property a passing grade a month before the fatal fire. Prabhat said she is considering taking legal action against the landlord. She believes some fault also lies with UB for not looking more closely into Parlato's ubhousing.com operation. It's shocking that the college also doesn't do any sort of checks before they let people post on these websites. It's about their student safety as well, Prabhat told Investigative Post. Brace, the former housing court liaison, said it's an ensemble cast, failing to hold landlords like Parlato accountable. You have a city inspection department that's not doing their job. You have Dabney as the housing court judge, who is not doing his job, Brace said. The system isn't broken, it's non-existent. A new threat to the press in New York. A bill passed overwhelmingly by the state legislature with little debate targets the press over the use of artificial intelligence. Supporters say it's aimed at rogue publishers, but critics say it's unconstitutional and poses a threat to legitimate news outlets. This is by Jim Haney. Government regulation of speech and the dissemination of news and opinion is prohibited by the First Amendment and numerous court cases from the Supreme Court on down. New York lawmakers have other thoughts. The State Assembly and Senate passed companion bills in the waning days and hours of the recently concluded legislative session that seek to require publishers and broadcasters to disclose and label content generated with the assistance of artificial intelligence. State Senator Patricia Fahey insists that her bill is not aimed at mainstream news outlets, such as daily newspapers, NPR outlets, and commercial television newsrooms. Rather, she said, it targets fly-by-night digital outlets that use AI to spread disinformation or pirate and misrepresent content from legitimate news outlets. Fahey contends, the legislation protects journalism in the long run. She said in an interview at Investigative Post, we think this is going to have extraordinary ramifications. Others say that the language of the bills is vague and represents a slippery slope that could be used by the government to undermine legitimate news organizations. Stephen Brill, co-CEO of NewsGuard, which fights abuses of artificial intelligence and disinformation on the World Wide Web, termed the legislation obviously unconstitutional and vulnerable to a legal challenge. We all agree certain content is bad, but the solution isn't government regulation. The legislation, dubbed the FAIR, F-A-I-R, News Act, requires outlets to disclose their content substantially composed, authored, or otherwise created through the use of generative artificial intelligence. It mandates the labeling of such content at the top of a print or digital story or at the beginning of audio or video content. The legislation authorizes that the state attorney general to determine what content is substantially created by AI and thus requires labeling. It calls for fines for failure to properly disclose. $1,000 for the first infraction, $5,000 for subsequent ones. Fahey said that the legislation protects legitimate news outlets because it exempts copyrighted content, which she said governs the work of mainstream publishers and broadcasters. But the press release issued by her office, hailing adoption of the legislation, casts a net that appears to ensnare all news media. No mention is made of reining in rogue outlets. The legislation mandates that news organizations operating in New York fully disclose to the public when they use generative AI to create news content, articles, or media, according to the press release. Accompanying statements from labor leaders who support the legislation cast it in terms of job protection or directed at mainstream news outlets. If media bosses want to use artificial intelligence in news gathering and analysis, then it must be under terms that are ethical, transparent, and enforceable, said Susan de Carava, president of the News Guild of New York. Joseph Finnerty, a media law attorney, said copyright of news content is a complicated legal question and does not provide a reliable benchmark for editors to determine when they might be a risk under this statute. Brill added that illegitimate news websites can also copyright their content. Copyright also protects the bad guys, he said, rendering the legislation's copyright exemption harmless and meaningless. Brill also expressed concern with granting the Attorney General the power to determine when content is substantially composed by AI and not protected by copyright. An abusive Attorney General could use it to punish legitimate news outlets, he said. Finnerty noted that news outlets are working to establish AI policies that promote transparency with their readers and viewers. All news organizations want to be transparent about its use, he said. They don't want to use AI to create content, but rather use it to collect and analyze data and perform other tasks that help journalists do their jobs. Diane Kennedy, president of the New York News Publishers Association, which is a trade group that represents daily and weekly newspapers across the state, wrote in a memorandum of opposition to Fahey's bill. No newspaper would be safe from investigation under this legislation. Another coalition of publishers cited legal precedents in opposing the legislation. Another coalition, which includes the New York State Broadcasters Association, wrote that the bills, if enacted, would send a chill through every newsroom and social media platform in New York State. Bill Infinity said the legislation runs afoul of the First Amendment, which prohibits both suppressing and compelling speech. It's compelling news organizations to publish speech the government wants them to publish, said Finnerty, whose clients include Scripps Media, Lee Enterprises, and Investigative Post. Brill added that the provision to label content as generated by AI is unconstitutional because it is forced speech. Fahey, a Democrat who represents Albany and communities west of the Capitol, said that she is surprised and disappointed at the criticism. We've had extraordinary support on this, she said. Indeed, organized labor has lobbied hard for the legislation, which originally would have strengthened the hands of unions when negotiating terms and conditions involving AI. The language was later removed from the bill, and supporters ranged from the state AFL-CIO and Communication Workers of America to the News Guild and Writers Guild of America. Finnerty said the fear of job losses due to AI is driving union support for the legislation. It's a legitimate issue, he said, but he criticized lawmakers for trying to pander to special interests and gambling with constitutional rights and the survival of news organizations. It's legislation at its worst. You're currently listening to a reading of articles and features from the Investigative Post and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The bills were approved 53-7 in the Senate and 130-1 in the Assembly, with 19 members marked as absent and excused. 3 members of the Western New York delegation co-sponsored the legislation: April Baskin in the Senate and Jonathan Rivera and Patrick Burke in the Assembly. All but 2 members of the delegation voted in favor of the legislation. Only Senator George Morello voted no, while Assembly member Angelo Marinello was marked as excused from voting. When questioned, Fahey said neither the Senate nor the Assembly considered the legislation in committee or even held any public hearings. The Senate approved the bill, with some debate, on June 3rd, 2 days before lawmakers recessed. The Assembly passed the bill without debate in the final hour of the session's last day, which was June 5th. The legislation is not a fait accompli. It requires a sign-off by Governor Kathy Hochul, and her position on the legislation is unknown. Kennedy of the Publishers Association said she'll encourage Hochul to veto the measure. In her memo of opposition, she noted nearly 40% of New York's newspapers have closed. It seems that the state legislature could better spend its resources to help preserve newspapers rather than attempting to regulate them and scaling back the information that they have always had the right to publish. Commission and fellow inmates call the jail death preventable. William Hager died of water intoxication at the Erie County Correctional Facility in Alden. A state report and 2 fellow inmates who watched him die say medical staff could have prevented his death. Nearly 3 years after a homeless veteran died in an Erie County jail by water intoxication, a state oversight body found that his death could have been prevented. The New York State Commission of Correction concluded that psychiatric staff at the Erie County Correctional Facility in Alden failed to adequately diagnose William Hager's psychosis and monitor side effects of a medication that he took. 2 former inmates housed in the same unit as Hager said that they saw the failings of the medical staff firsthand, and they watched their neighbor deteriorate, then died before their eyes. I believe it was the fault of the medical unit and not the sheriff's, Nicholas Strachan, an inmate who lived in close proximity to Hager at Alden, told the Investigative Post in an interview this spring. Hager had a history of schizophrenia, and the antipsychotic medication that he took is known to cause the side effect of extreme thirst. But according to the state's report published last week, Alden psychiatrists failed to follow up on Hager's previous complaints of medication effects or to do any effective monitoring of him. Their inaction proved fatal. The board opines that had proper medication monitoring of Hager been ordered and implemented, his excessive water intake could have been recognized, had intervention initiated, and his death prevented, the report stated. The state's report also faulted a nurse for failing to alert the doctors about Hager's loss of nearly 13 pounds in the 2 weeks that he was housed at the Erie County Holding Center in downtown after being arrested for theft and property damage charges. Medical had just ignored the fact that he was starving to death, Strachan said. I kept telling the corrections officers, why am I taking care of Bill this way? Why isn't someone from medical doing this? The unredacted portions of the state's report do not include interviews with Strachan or any other inmates. The report has been shared with jail staff and several county officials, including Sheriff John Garcia and the chair of the county legislature. The report includes a response from the sheriff's office and the jail's physician rejecting the state's assessment that staff could have been monitored Hager's symptoms and prevented his death. Krista Horvatitz, spokesperson for the sheriff, did not respond to requests for comment. Investigative Post reported on Hager's death in 2024. Hager's family declined to comment on the state's report due to a pending federal lawsuit against the sheriff's office. Previously, they had told Investigative Post that Hager's criminal history was tied to a life of drug addiction, mental illness, and fighting for survival on the streets. He wasn't dangerous at all, Jennifer Hager, his sister, said in 2024. Any of the trouble that he got himself into was just trying to live. He was homeless. Hager enlisted in the U.S. Army after high school and was honorably discharged after a few years of service. Because of a back injury and a diagnosis of schizophrenia in his 30s, Hager received disability benefits. It took nearly 3 years for the state's Commission of Correction to investigate Hager's death, a practice that follows after any inmate dies in state or local jails. The investigation is done by a board of medical experts who then share their findings with the Commission and, in this case, with jail and county officials. The Commission's report is based on interviews with Alden staff, including a psychiatrist, 2 corrections officers, and at least 1 nurse. Much of it is redacted. According to the report, William Hager's final stay in county jail began on August 3, 2023. He'd been arrested on a warrant for a number of charges, including criminal mischief and petty larceny. He awaited arraignment at the downtown holding center until August 17th, when he was transferred to Alden. And at that time, the report noted that Hager had lost 12.6 pounds in 14 days. But nurses at the holding center failed to notify Alden doctors. That's the first misstep that the Commission attributed to medical staff. The report also raised other questions about medical staff's treatment of Hager. Why was there no clearly established diagnosis for Hager that had been done, considering his psychiatric history and evidence of psychosis? Why did medical staff fail to follow up on Hager's side effects of extreme thirst? And why did psychiatrists fail to monitor Hager for metabolic syndrome, the state norm to adhere to for any inmate on an antipsychotic medication? The report mandated a quality assurance review led by the county jail's chief medical officer and a report of its findings to the Commission. In January, the sheriff's office completed the review but did not identify any policy or procedure violations by the health staff. The state attorney general's office also investigates jail deaths. A spreadsheet of the results of such investigations indicate that the AG concluded officer did not cause death. From the middle of August 2023 until his death on November 19th of that year, Hager stayed in a special wing at the Alden Jail called Medical Unit 2, or M2. He often stayed in his room, pacing or sitting on his bed, though former inmates occasionally convinced Hager to watch TV or go outside to stretch and socialize. One officer, referred to as DG in the report, told the Commission that Hager was a quiet man, probably the quietest incarcerated individual that he ever had. According to the report, M2 is designed to support inmates with mental health conditions. Indeed, it cells share walls with doctors and nurses, the premise being that inmates will get close around-the-clock attention, if need be. But that did not happen, Strachan told Investigative Post. They just didn't care. They were just there like, oh, you don't want to take your pills? No problem. And they would just walk away, he said. Strachan wondered how it was possible that medical staff could be on the other side of the wall chatting and laughing while Hager's health deteriorated. We were over here. Bill's struggling, Strachan said. He should be under 24-hour care with somebody who's really there for him, to convince him that he's not living in literal hell. Hager became convinced that Lake Erie had dried up, according to a corrections officer interviewed in the state's report. Strachan said the same thing, as did Anthony Urbalina, another inmate who lived a few cells down from Hager. As a result, Hager stopped flushing the toilet and showering. He was talking about everything was getting smaller, how the world was shrinking and everything, said Evelina. The report concluded that Hager's psychosis had not been addressed by Alden staff. Furthermore, it was his medication, Zyprexa, which had caused Hager extreme thirst. Hager's complaints of increased thirst were indicative of these side effects occurring, but were not addressed by the attending psychiatrist, the report stated, adding that the psychiatrist had also failed to order lab work to assess the medication's other side effects. Irvely and Strachan often spoke to corrections officers about Hager. They said they told the guards that Hager had stopped eating, and at one point he was convinced that the chicken inmates were fed was human meat and abandoned personal hygiene. They said that Hager frequently defecated in his clothes, which the inmates would wash for him. They said their pleas for help fell on deaf ears. I told the correction officers he's trying to kill himself. He's drinking tons of water. He's throwing up violently every day, said Evelina. You could tell he was just dying. According to the officer, DG, on the day that Hager died, he'd observed Hager drinking a lot of water, several cups in a row. But he told commission staff that it did not strike him as odd enough to notify the medical staff. 2 medical entries were made for Hager on that day, one in the morning, which noted that Hager refused to go to mental health, and another around 1 p.m. when Hager spoke with a mental health counselor. Guards had done their rounds throughout the day, but no one had heard from Hager. When a corrections officer went to check on him at 7:09 p.m., Hager began to shake, and he was looking up towards the cell light, and then he fell down, according to the report. That officer called a medical emergency. The following moments were not detailed in the commission's report, but according to Strachan and Evelina, the emergency response team lacked the proper life-saving device, which caused a 30-minute delay in treatment. I think that directly contributed to Bill not being alive today, Strachan said. Jail officials conducted internal reviews of Hager's death and denied any wrongdoing. The facility indicated that they disagreed with the medical review board and regarding Hager's diagnosis and side effects to prescribe medication, the report stated. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Investigative Post. We read from the Investigative Post on Thursdays at 8:30 a.m. Your reader has been Jeff Shapiro. Thank you for listening.
Good morning. Welcome to another broadcast day on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, a private not-for-profit organization. Please stay with us. Our Reading About Phone News is coming up next. Our phone number here is area code 716-821-5555. Just a quick programming note, the offices of the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service will be closed tomorrow Friday, June 19th, in the observance of the Juneteenth holiday. I'll come with you later for